Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Diane Baden, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. We are pleased to present this webinar in our series on RDA, Resource Description and Access. Our presenter is once again Adam Schiff, Principal Cataloger at the University of Washington Libraries, Seattle, Washington. Adam served as chair of one of the two RDA examples groups, and he has given numerous presentations on the differences between AACR2 and RDA. At any time during the webinar, if you have questions for Adam, please type them into the question box on your screen. Adam will leave time at the end to respond to as many questions as possible. Please note that we are recording the webinar, and you will receive an email with a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And now I will turn the program over to Adam. There will be a slight pause as we change presenters.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back for most of you who've attended before, and for those of you who didn't attend last week, I'd like to welcome you to today as well. I want to point out that this presentation was originally prepared for a pre-conference session back in April 2010 at the British Columbia Library Conference, and it is are you seeing my screen now? There we go. Again, this was presented at the British Columbia Library Association Conference and has been greatly enhanced and evolved since April of last year. And I really want to thank Judy Kuhagen of the Policy and Standards Division at the Library of Congress for reviewing several different drafts of it, making suggestions for improving it, and clarifying a number of misunderstandings that I had along the way. And I just want to point out that no, that monkey on my back is not RDA. Just a repeat of a slide from last week for those of you who didn't attend. I'm not going to talk about this slide much, but I worked from a list of changes that was compiled by the JSC that's available at this website. And if you're interested in MARC changes, you can go to this URL for MARC changes. And also, if you're an OCLC user, OCLC Technical Bulletin 258 has a lot of important information about how OCLC will implement the MARC changes for RDA. A few words about relationships. In RDA, there is much more importance given to indicating the nature of relationships than there was in AACR2. And there are three types of relationships that are covered by various chapters in RDA, and then there are three appendices with lists of relationship designators that can be used in conjunction with access points to indicate explicitly the type of relationship. The designators are not required elements, but their use may enable systems to do some things that they cannot now do. And I'm hoping that when we actually do implement RDA, that that most of us will actually use these relationship designators so that we can do interesting things like being able to limit to a certain type of role that a person might have with regard to a resource. In the examples in the upcoming slides, I've always shown the use of the relationship designators when appropriate, but just remember that they are optional in RDA. So today we're going to talk about access points, and then we're going to actually look at authority records as well. And what I've done is taken what I think are the most important issues dealing with changes in access points from AACR2 to RDA. And probably one of the most important ones that people are aware of is that we've gotten rid of the rule of three. So in AACR2, when you had more than 3 authors, we entered a work under its title, and we made an added entry for the first named author. And that's shown on this slide here. In RDA, there's no limit to the number of added entries. They're not called added entries, but access points that you can give for people related to a work. And we name a work differently than we do in AACR2 as well. So as you can see in RDA, although there are 5 authors of this work, the work would be named with the combination of the 100 and the 245 field in this case. So Mr. Tracy gets to be part of the name of the work, and he gets recorded in a 100 field. And then we also have 700 added entries for the other authors. Now, I just want to point out that the policy on how many names we looked last week that you can actually, there's an alternative that says you could do John Tracy and 4 others. And the policy on how many names to give in a statement of responsibility doesn't automatically correspond to the same policy for how many authorized access points you give. You could give and 4 others in the 245 and still give 4 700 fields, or you could give all the names in the 245, but RDA only requires the first named person to be recorded, so only Tracy could be given without the 700s. I don't personally think that's a really great idea not to give the access points for the other creators of this work, because it doesn't meet really the principles of being able to find all the works by a particular person in your catalog if you don't provide those access points. Here's another example showing an edited volume. Again, in AACR2, you had a work that was by editors would be entered under its title, and if you had 3 or more than 3 editors, you'd have to replace, you'd give edited by the first name followed by the Latin et al, and of course an added entry for the first named editor. In RDA, you would record all of the names in the statement of responsibility if you chose to follow that basic instruction in RDA, and then you would give access points for each of the named editors. And again, you can see as well the use of a relationship designator, which comes from Appendix I of RDA. In this case, the appropriate one is editor of compilation. There's a change in how we deal with compilations lacking a collective title. A very common example are sound recordings, where you might have 3 different works on a sound recording, and there is no collective title for that. The disc label just lists each of the 3 works. In AACR2, we would give a main entry for the first name work and a uniform title if needed, and then we would give analytical added entries for the other works. This is a bit misleading because it's a collection, and so we would be using this name of this Baden symphony to represent this collection, which is a little bit actually not accurate. In RDA, we treat these differently. If a compilation lacks a collective title, we're told to construct separate access points for each of the works in the compilation. And we're given an alternative as well, which I'll talk about in the next slide. If you're giving in RDA separate access points, you would name, there would be no official name for this work. You would see we have 3 analytical access points in this case. One important rule to mention in RDA is instruction 17.8, which deals with work manifested. And this is a core element, and it says that if more than one work is embodied in the manifestation, only the predominant or first name work manifested is required. But basically this tells us to record either the first named or all of the works manifested in a collection like this. And it would be up to us to decide whether we would give access points for all 3 or just the first or just a predominant one. Again, it makes sense in this case probably to give access points for all 3. Now there's an alternative to Rule 627.1.4, which says that instead of or in addition to constructing access points for each of the works in the compilation, you can construct an authorized access point representing the compilation using a devised title formulated according to the instructions in 2.3.2.11. Now, whether to devise a title proper was cataloger's judgment during the national RDA test. But if a cataloger decided to devise a title, you can see an example of what that would look like on this slide. We've got 3 Norwegian symphonies, so we come up with a title. We make a note that it's a title, and then we can give, in RDA, we have the issue of the works manifested, and we can record those in a contents note as a 505, or we could record them as access points, analytical access points, or we could do both. It would be cataloger's judgment which convention to use. A change in the way two or more unnumbered or non-consecutively numbered parts of a work are recorded in RDA. The basic rule in AACR2 said that if you have 3 or more unnumbered or non-consecutively numbered parts of or extracts from a work, use the uniform title for the whole work followed by selections. Now in RDA, we're told that we have, when identifying 2 or more unnumbered or non-consecutively numbered parts of a work, construct authorized access points for each of the parts. And that's what this slide illustrates. If we were to follow the basic rule, you would see that we would have analytical access points for each of the 4 parts, which are numbered books of Homer's Iliad. Now there is an alternative to this rule that says that when you're identifying 2 or more unnumbered or non-consecutively numbered parts of a work, treat the parts as an expression of the whole work. Construct the authorized access point representing this expression by adding the term selections to the authorized access point representing the work as a whole. And if you were to apply that alternative, you would end up basically with a similar situation that you have in AACR2. So we would represent this expression by using the name for the work, Iliad, and adding selections to it. The LC practice during the RDA test for this alternative was to apply this alternative and to use the what we would call in AACR2 the uniform title, Iliad selections. And then you could, if you wanted, add analytical access points for each of the books, but that would not be required by RDA if you took this alternative. A little bit about related works. You can see relationships now in RDA can be spelled out using relationship designators. And so you can see an example of a sequel to Gone with the Wind, where in AACR2 we would make an added entry for the related work, but we would have to indicate what the relationship was in a note, in this case a 500 note. In RDA, we can use a relationship designator from the appendix that deals with related works, and we would record that in the added entry itself. So you see the subfield I sequel to in front of the authorized access point for the work. And I do want to point out that if you're looking at the relationship designators in RDA, they're all in lowercase, but there's an LC policy statement that says when you're using a relationship designator in subfield I, it is the first subfield, the first word is capitalized, and add a colon to the end of it. Here's a similar case, but for a related expression, and this is something different that we wouldn't do in AACR2. Here's a translation of a work that was originally in Spanish into English. In AACR2, we would have a uniform title with the name, the original title in Spanish, followed by the language of the translation. That is actually the same in RDA, but in addition, you can give the related work in an access point. So you could note that in a 700 field with a subfield I translation of and the name of the original work, and that's a little bit different. Something that we don't do. We rely on the uniform title in AACR2 in the original language followed by the language to tell us that what we have is a translation of that work. Okay, moving right along. I want to talk a little bit about personal name headings. And in RDA, fictitious entities and real non-human entities can receive access points as creators and contributors. And here are 2 well-known examples of fictitious and non-human entities. So in the first example, we have a work that says it's by Miss Piggy as told to Henry Beard. Henry Beard is actually the author, and in AACR2, if the actual known author of a work ascribed to a fictitious person would be entered under the actual known author. So we have main entry under Beard. In RDA, we are told that persons include fictitious entities, and so if the statement of responsibility says that Miss Piggy wrote the book, then she can have an access point. So we'll have, and if she's the creator in this case, she will be given a 100 field, and we'll give an access point as well for Mr. Beard, who is the actual author. In the second case on the slide, you see it's attributed to Kermit the Frog, and it's not known in who the actual author is. So in AACR2, we would enter that under title, but in RDA, again, we would enter it under the author, Kermit. And here's an example of a real non-human entity. This was a book published in 1998, I think, of letters to Socks and Buddy, who were the Clintons' pets. And in AACR2, Socks and Buddy do not get access points. Animals cannot get access points. They're not considered capable of authorship. In RDA, they are. So you can see that we would get access points for Socks as the addressee of the letters and Buddy as addressee of the letters. A little bit about pseudonyms. RDA doesn't have the restriction that AACR2 has on non-contemporaries, and those are people before who have died before January 1st, 1901. Sorry, let's get that right. Non-contemporaries are anybody who has died before January 1st, 1901. So if an individual is a non-contemporary, AACR2 requires them to have separate bibliographic identities in order for there to be authorized access points for each identity. That restriction goes away in RDA. Personal name headings. There are quite a few other changes that I don't have time to cover, but the next slides illustrate some of the significant changes in the formulation of access points. Here's one where in AACR2 we're told not to add other titles or terms associated with names entered under surname unless they're required to distinguish between two or more persons with the same name and you don't have dates or fuller forms available. So we would get the case of Hank Williams Jr. Where we have his birth date, so the heading would not include Jr. in AACR2. Whereas in RDA, we're told that those terms indicating relationship are treated as part of the preferred name. So Mr. Williams would include Jr. as well as the date in his heading. A little bit about dates in personal headings. I'm showing here the actual AACR2 forms from 2217A and what they would look like in RDA. So in some cases there's no change, and in other cases we have changes. Now from last week you'll remember that we don't like abbreviations. So months will no longer be abbreviated and will be spelled out. You can see that circa in Latin becomes approximately. And you can see that the B period and the D period from AACR2 become either you could spell out the word born or spell out the word die, but LC practice during the test was to use a hyphen either after a date or before a date to indicate that a person had died. Now, I want to point out that the various dates associated with a person, which include birth date, death date, and period of activity, are separate elements in RDA, but because they all map to the MARC X00 subfield D, something extra is needed when encoding those RDA elements in access points to give those dates meaning. So we have to add these hyphens, or we have to add the word born, died, etc., to give those dates meaning in a MARC record. So the last two examples in this slide are not pure RDA, they're RDA and MARC. A few more dates. Flourished has gone away. Well, the FL abbreviation has gone away. The examples in RDA use the word flourished, but LC has decided during the test they preferred to use the word active. And so it's probable that we'll use the word active in NACO if a decision is made to use to actually implement RDA. Also, you see that abbreviations changed as well from century to spelled out forms. And here's an example of an RDA authority record for a person who has a date of activity, just to show you. Okay, a little bit about qualifiers. In AACR2, if you had neither a fuller form of name nor dates available to distinguish between identical headings when the entry element was a given name, we are told to devise a suitable brief term and add it in parentheses. So those are the examples you see, the first two examples. We're also told that if neither a fuller form of name nor dates are available to distinguish between identical headings of which the entry element is a surname, then we can add a qualifier such as a term of honor, term of address, title of position or office, initials of an academic degree, or membership in an organization that appear with the name. So these examples on the left of the screen are from AACR2, and I'm showing on the right what they would look like in RDA. So you can see that these terms of honor, terms of address, title of position, etc. are no longer used in RDA. Instead, we're told that if we need something to differentiate people with the same name and we don't have dates or fuller forms of name, we have an order of preference. And the first order of preference would be to add the profession or occupation of the person to the access point. If that is unavailable, we can add a field of activity. Or if we have nothing available, we would end up with an undifferentiated name. So John Smith Sir, depending on his profession or occupation, would get a qualifier for that particular profession or occupation or field of activity. Captain George Brown, if he's a captain in the military, the qualifier might be soldier, but if he's a captain in the fire department, perhaps it would be some other, it would be a fireman or something like that. So my examples here are not necessarily prescriptive, they're just showing what possibilities. Reverend George Brown presumably would be clergyman, but you could probably use priest or some other term to indicate that. And again, you can see the change to musicians where we would have a lowercase word, and now that would be enclosed in parentheses and capitalized. And here's an example of an authority record showing that addition. There are other Paul Fromers in the authority file, and to distinguish him, Brigham Young Music Library in the RDA test created this authority record and added the qualifier composer in parentheses. A little bit about family names. I'm not going to talk a lot about the rules, but there's now a chapter in RDA that deals with family names, and this is something new from AACR2. There are various elements defined for family names that include the preferred name, the variant name, type of family, date associated with the family, etc. And there are also some new MARC authority fields that can be used to record some of these attributes, and we'll look at those later on. And I just want to point out that in MARC, in the family fields, we'll use, of course, X00, and the type of family is included in the subfield A, as you'll see in the next slide. If the dates are included with the heading, with the access point, they go into subfield D. Places will go into subfield C, and prominent member of the family goes into subfield G. And here are some examples showing those different types of access points with various MARC coding. Conferences, congresses, fairs, festivals, etc. In RDA, there's only one instruction for conferences, congresses, meetings, exhibitions, fairs, etc. And this results in the following changes from AACR2. Frequency will now be retained in the preferred name of a conference, congress, meeting, etc. So you can see the first two examples. We would include the word annual or biannual in the authorized access point, where in AACR2 we dropped it off. Years of convocation will be omitted from preferred names of exhibitions, fairs, and festivals, but will be included as an addition to the authorized access point. So you can see the Expo 86 becomes Expo by itself, and then the year gets added to the qualifier. Festival, Flowers 94, same thing. And then finally, location will be included as an addition to the authorized access point, even if the location is part of the preferred name of the body, where we did not include that in the qualifier in AACR2. And a little bit of a minor change in how we will record multiple locations of conferences. Instead of when you have two places, two locations separating them by commas and the word and, we will use semicolons to separate each of the places. And instead, when you have more than 3, you would, instead of using etc., I'm sorry, not more than 3, but 3 or more locations, you would use etc. in AACR2, but in RDA, you would record each of the place names separated by semicolons. Okay, uniform titles. In RDA, you can see the example here of a work that is in French and English, Bear in a Square, L'ours dans le carré, and we would use a uniform title for the title in the original language, which is the English Bear in a Square, followed by the title of the translation, and if the original was also there, you would have French & English. In RDA, we don't have those kinds of constructions for names of expressions. Instead, we're told that if a single expression of a work involves more than one language, record each of the languages. And you can see that in the RDA example where each of the languages is recorded here as an access point in the 700 analytical edit entry. Now, again, I want to point out instruction 1710, which deals with expressions manifested. And it becomes a core element. Expression manifested is a core element if there's more than one expression of the work manifested. Like in this case, we have an expression in English and an expression in French. Now, if more than one expression is embodied in the manifestation, only the predominant or first named expression manifested is required. So technically, only the first 700 in my screen is required, and it's the English one. And I would say it's the first name one because of the 245 being the English title. However, I don't think it would be a very good practice for us to give only the access point for the English. That's already the name of the original, and people looking for a French translation would not find this. So it would be catalogger's judgment actually as to which to give, whether you'd give the English or the French, but I think not giving the French at all would be a disservice to users. Now, I want to point out also that giving the language of the original expression in an access point is not something we have done in the U.S. for AACR2. Library of Congress only gives the language of expression for a translation. And so this policy in RDA will need to be reconsidered if RDA is to be implemented in the U.S. Again, another thing about uniform titles, showing an example of an expression where in AACR2 we would use the term polyglot, and we don't have that term anymore. We would give access points for each of the expressions. Uniform titles, here's a change from AACR2 to RDA, where we have selections in AACR2 followed by the year of the expression, and in RDA we would always give the word works before selections. And there's a Library of Congress policy statement that says routinely add the date of the expression to the authorized access point that uses a conventional title that begins with works as the preferred title. Now, in fulfilling the 17.8 or 17.10 core requirements of expression manifested or work manifested, the cataloger would also need to give a contents note, either a contents note 505, which would be basically a structured description, or an analytical edit entries, or they could give both. They could give an analytical entry for each of the works in this selection, or for just the predominant one if they wanted to. Okay. Little bit about changes to works scripturals, works accepted as sacred scripture. Basically, the rule is the same. The one main change is that we're going to change the way we spell Quran, and so you can see that on this slide. There's a few more examples added to the RDA. And there's one exception for the way sacred scriptures are named. In AACR2, they're always named by title. They're entered under title. In RDA, there's an exception because there are some sacred works that are attributed to a single person, and so RDA has accommodated that. There's a change to parts of the Bible, First of all, we get rid of abbreviations. So OT and NT are out and replaced by the fully spelled out forms Old Testament and New Testament. And then the individual books of the Bible will no longer be named using an intermediate Old Testament or New Testament as part of their name, as you can see in this slide. Versions of the Bible, similar thing. All of the, you can see that in some of these we're getting rid of NT or OT. The other main change for versions is that we're getting rid of Latin. So as you can see in the last two examples where we would use et al, we would replace that now with and others in English. I'm going to skip over. I have a bunch of slides here from musical works, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over them. There's actually a pre-conference going on as I speak in Philadelphia at the Music Library Association conference, an all-day pre-conference on music in RDA. And you can come back to these at your leisure and take a look. What I've done is highlight some of the key changes for musical works. And what I want to talk about in the last remaining 15 minutes that I have to talk are authority records. How to identify RDA authority records. In MARC 21 authority records, you will see, if it's an RDA record, the 040 subfield E with value RDA. And you will also see that the 00810, which is the rules byte, will be coded Z for other. Now, in existing AACR2 records during the testing period, they didn't change the AACR2 authorized form, but they added a 7XX linking field with the RDA form, whether it was the same as AACR2 or different, and they encoded that with a second indicator value of 4, which means source not specified. I also want to point out that the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging will, if RDA is to be implemented, consider if some existing AACR2 forms and authority records are RDA compatible. These 7XX linking fields that they've added with the RDA form will not just automatically be flipped without consideration of the categories of differences between AACR2 and pure RDA forms. There are likely to be certain categories where we will accept the AACR2 form even though it's not the actual RDA form, but it's good enough, compatible enough. And additional RDA elements could be recorded separately in the newly created MARC fields available for them without actually having to be added to the authorized AACR2 access point. So just stay tuned for further news from Library of Congress and PCC about this. So here's an example from OCLC of an RDA authority record. You can see the rules is coded Z for other, and then the actual code for which rules is coded in the 040 subfield E. This was an RDA record. Here is an example of an AACR2 record that was where the RDA form has been added in a 7XX linking field. So, of course, the rules will stay as showing as AACR2, and you have an AACR2 heading in the 110. But we've added a 710 with the RDA form, which is actually different, as you notice, because one of the changes from AACR2 to RDA is that it's actually not a change in it from AACR2 to RDA. It's a change from the LCRIs interpreting AACR2 in that we will now be spelling out words like department that were abbreviated. I want to point out two important instructions from Chapter 0 of RDA, and I want to thank Judy Kuhagen again for reminding me to look at these two instructions. These have to do with when you're recording additional elements needed to differentiate works and expressions or differentiate persons, families, corporate bodies with same or similar names. RDA does not require that elements which are does not require that these elements actually have to be recorded as separate elements. They can be added to the access point, and that satisfies these requirements that are spelled out in 0.63 and 0.64. Now, in the following slides, the separate element is shown in authority records simply to show the possible use of the new MARC fields for the element. But just note that including these separate elements is optional because the required elements are always included in the authorized access point, at least according to the Library of Congress policy statements for 0.63 and 0.64. So okay, some new MARC authority fields. We looked at 046 last week. So the 046 is also in the MARC authority field for special coded dates, and it corresponds. It has some subfields that are used to encode elements in RDA for date of work, date of expression, date associated with a person, date associated with a family, and date associated with a corporate body. And you can see all the subfields that have been established that correspond to those. Here's an example showing that in an authority record. Notice the access point has the person's birth and death dates, but they've also been recorded separately. And the idea is that if we record these elements separately, it's possible that in the future machines can do all kinds of interesting things with these separately recorded data. So it would be much easier for a machine to do a search and limit on find everybody born in 1930 if that particular data element is recorded separately somewhere. And I want to also point out that although just years are shown in the 046 in this example, detailed dates can also be given in some of the subfields in 046. So if you have a year, month, date, you can actually record that as well in the form YYY, month, MMDD. So 4 for the year, 2 for the month, and 2 for the day. And you can see examples in the MARC authority format showing that. Here's just an example of a recording of a date of creation of a work. This date is not needed to distinguish this work from others, but it was decided by the cataloger who created this authority record to record the date of creation in the 046. And you can imagine if you have this information, you could do searches on show me all the works that were created in 1957. Another slide just showing different subfields for use with dates associated with a family. Another new MARC field, the 336. We saw this 336 already when we discussed part 1 for description, and it's available for use in the authority format as well, and can be used can be added to access points to distinguish them certain expressions from other expressions. So this is just the table out of 6.9 showing the terms that you can record, and here's an authority record for a graphic novel showing that the content is text and still image. And 1336 is also possible. Subfield A is repeatable, so this could have been recorded in 1336 with a repeatable subfield A. New MARC authority fields in the 370s to 380s. So we've got a new field for associated place, which corresponds to the elements that you see on the screen in RDA, some of which are core elements, particularly when core elements when needed to differentiate one work or one family or a corporate body from another corporate body. And you can see each of these things gets its own subfield. So place of birth, place of death, country, associated country, etc. And here's an example showing place of birth and a place of death that have been optionally recorded separately in the 370. And here's an example of a place of origin of work that has been recorded separately and also as an addition to the access point, because there's more than one Big Brother television program, the cataloger used the country place of origin to break the conflict. Another new field is address, which corresponds to RDA elements for address of the person and address of the corporate body. And here's an example showing that in an authority record. I'm skipping real fast through these. I know you can come back to them later on and look in more detail at the MARC format. Another example showing electronic address. We have new MARC fields for field of activity and occupation. And these are core elements when needed to distinguish people from other people with the same name if you don't have dates or fuller forms of name. And we saw this example already with Mr. Fromer. Here's an example where we've got a field of activity of a corporate body that has been optionally recorded. We have new fields for affiliation and gender that correspond to MARC elements. And here's one authority record showing this person's affiliation as well as her gender. We have a whole new field for family information. And some of the elements are core elements. Here's the type of family that has been recorded in the 376. As you can see, it's also in the access point in the 100. And one thing I do want to point out is that there's a new policy for subject usage. While in RDA you can create access points for families as creators and contributors, and you cannot use these families as subject headings. LC has decided that they want us to continue using a more general family name heading from LCSH. So these family authority records all have the subject usage note added to them, and you can see the fixed field coding also that says that this heading, this access point, cannot be used as a subject. And here's just an example showing family information recorded separately as well as part of the access point. We've got a new field for associated language, and that corresponds to RDA elements for language of the person and language of the corporate body. And there is another element, language of expression, and the use of this field for that is under discussion within the MARC community. And this is an example of an authority record where the languages of the person have been recorded using the MARC language codes. We saw these last week, the 380 and the 381 for form of work and other distinguishing characteristics of a work. And they, again, become core elements when needed to differentiate works from each other. So here's an example showing the use of both of them. There were two films in 1965 named with the title Harlow, and so Douglas is the director's name of this one and has been added to the access point. And in this case, Douglas is the other distinguishing characteristic of this work, along with the form of work. Here's another example showing the other distinguishing characteristic. This is the issuing body that is used as an addition to a title of a series. A monograph series is very generic, and so we've added the qualifier for the issuing body. And if you were recording that separately in RDA, that's the other distinguishing characteristic. Some same MARC fields that we saw in bib records that are used in authority records for music. And I'm just going to skip over these real quickly because I want to talk about relationship coding. It's the last thing I want to cover. We have relationship designation that you can do in authority records as well as in bib records. And there's a new subfield I for relationship information, and you can use the designators from appendices J and K. And in addition to using the subfield I, you also need to include the subfield W, the control subfield, which indicates indicate what type of relationship you're encoding. So if we're going to be encoding relationship designators, we are going to use the subfield W first byte position of R, which is defined as relationship designator is in subfield I or subfield full form. So here are some authority records showing the relationship designators taken from RDA Appendix J, which have been recorded in association with the authorized access points for the related works. So we have Planet of the Apes, the 1968 motion picture, which is an adaptation of Pierre Boulle's Planète des Singes, and has also been remade as a film in 2001 and has a sequel. And all of these relationships can now be recorded in authority records with explicit explanation of what the relationships are with these designators. Here's just showing the reciprocal relationship to the previous slide. So this is the authority record for the novel Planète des Singes, showing the reciprocal relation that it has been adapted as a motion picture, actually twice. Here's an explicit relationship between a corporate body and a person that has been explicitly recorded in the authority record. So the corporate body Bowler Press was founded by Jarrett Morrison, and that relationship is not the kind of relationship we would have put in an AACR2 authority record, but we can record it in our RDA. And this is just the reciprocal relationship from Morrison to the press. And another example showing relationship of a family to a person. So from the Weir family to its relationship to its progenitor, Robert Weir. And these relationships from between persons or between families or between persons and families and corporate bodies, etc., come out of Appendix K in RDA, Appendix K. And this is the reciprocal relationship to the previous one. And then finally, an interesting one that we don't record as well in RDA, in AACR2, is the relationship of a parent to a subordinate corporate body, which we don't express this, at least this way, in AACR2 authority records. So here is a branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a related access point has been recorded for its hierarchical superior, as well as its incumbent, which is also, we have not generally done in these types of authority records in AACR2. And finally, one last thing I want to talk about is how we record earlier-later relationships. In AACR2, we have the control subfield W with a first position value of A for earlier heading or B for later heading. And you can see in AACR2 that's how we record an earlier-later situation. Now, RDA tells us we can use a relationship designator, and the corresponding relationship designator in this case is predecessor. And so we have a kind of a conflict. Now, during the LC practice for the test, LC said to continue to use the codes A and B in subfield W for the earlier later. And then if we implement, if LC and PCC implements RDA, we're going to need to have a consistent policy and decide what we all will do, because I don't think we want some people using the RDA relationship designators while others use the codes A and B for earlier later. Okay, I've rushed through a lot of slides, and I am going to try and look at your questions now. And first I've got to find them. Here we go. Okay. There's a question that says, for the recording example with a made-up title, do you not record or indicate what appears on the chief source? So that's with when you've given the devise title. Well, I think you could record what appears. Well, there is no chief source in RDA. RDA. That phrase doesn't exist in RDA. There are preferred sources that you can use, but you pretty much in RDA you can take information from most any source. But if you're choosing, let's say you have a recording on a disk, I think you're asking about, so there's 3 things without a collective title. You can record those in the contents note. So recording them as you see it, as it appears, could be recorded in your 505, which would be the description as found on the item. And let's see. Another question, is there a list of approved words to use for the name of a profession or occupation? For example, fisher versus fisherman, or physician versus doctor. There is not at present. I think the JSC has talked about whether they want to have a controlled vocabulary for that, but at present there is no controlled vocabulary for those terms. So you take the information from any source and you can use any term at this point. And I guess in the future, if the JSC decides they want to have a controlled vocabulary to use with that, they can develop that and add that as an appendix or something to RDA. Why do you need to say editor of compilation? We don't say author of book. The reason is that there's a separate designator for editor. That's a different role than editor of compilation. So they needed to have a way to distinguish those. The editor would be somebody who, you take somebody's work and they do the editing of it. Maybe they correct typos or misspellings. They change some words. They may add some footnotes and things like that, but so that's what they mean by editor. Whereas the editor of the compilation is somebody who selects and arranges all other works into a compilation. So that's why we have that difference, different functions. I thought Roman numerals were out, but in the Bible access points they were there. No, Roman numerals are not necessarily out, and without going back into RDA, I'd have to go back and look at the actual rules in RDA, but no, they're not out for books of the Bible. They're still used, I believe. Question is, there are a lot more fields added to implement RDA for MARC authority records. This will be significant in catalogers' workloads. How will libraries be able to take on such increase in work without additional resources? It's a good question. Remember, a lot of these fields that have been added to RDA are optional fields because the data that you're recording is already included in an access point, for example. So you wouldn't necessarily have to repeat that data in these new fields. That being said, I think if we do make use of these fields, we may be able to develop really all kinds of interesting products that enable interesting searches and limits and things like that in our systems that we can't do with just what we put in access points. So I can't answer your question as to how libraries will be able to take on additional increase in work. It's going to be a fine line between deciding what we can do for efficiency in RDA versus what we just can't do because we don't have the staffing or resources to do it. We'll see. I think LC certainly had those discussions among its folks, and I'm sure the Program for Cooperative Cataloging will have them as well. You mentioned the different subject usage for family names. Am I correct in thinking that in your example qualified by WVA as an authority, it would only be the last name followed by the family as a subject? Yes. So, for example, a specific Brown family could be named as an access point, particularly if you're collecting the archival records of the family or they've created some other kind of work that you are cataloging. You can name that specific family with its dates and its location and its progenitor or a combination of those. Whereas from a subject point of view, LC has decided that we're just going to use Brown family as the subject heading. Now the question says, won't this end up being confusing in those authority files where name is kept in the name file, whether used as a subject or an author? Possibly. I'm not sure the answer to that. But you would have the generic family and the generic and the more specific family in your authority file, but only one would be used as a subject. So in your subject index, you should only have one. Let's see, the question, what's the difference between field of activity and occupation? I think that would probably be the last one I can take. There's a lot of controversy and questioning about that. If you look at the RDA definitions, field of activity is a discipline or field or some kind of activity that a person is known for, but it's probably not their occupation. So in my mind, I like to think of it very often as a hobby or something that something is known for that isn't really they don't make money off of. Now that isn't the definition in RDA, but somebody who's a stamp collector, for example, I see that as a field of activity and not as an occupation. I suppose you can make money off of stamp collecting. So there's a lot of discussion about merging those two elements. They're separate elements because they're separate in Ferber, they're separate in Ferber and Frad in those models, but there's a lot of overlap and confusion about them, and I think it's highly likely that the JSC is going to talk about merging the two. There's certainly been calls from various folks to do that. Okay, I think I have to stop here. I will answer the other questions that are here, and we'll send those answers out as soon as possible within the next few days. And I'm going to turn the program over back to Diane now. And I want to thank everybody for listening and remind you that if you go to, that we'll be sending out I think a PDF that include all of my speaker notes as well, so you'll get a lot more information than I was able to cover just speaking quickly. So thanks.
Thank you, Adam, for covering so much material in such a short time. I want to reiterate what Adam just told you. First of all, you will get his presentation with the speaker notes. I know some of you had audio issues, but you will get the full content. And Adam will answer all of the questions, and you will get the questions and answers sent to you in a week or so. On the screen right now is the schedule of our upcoming webinars in the RDA series. And again, there is special pricing if you register for more than one of these. So feel free to sign up for any of these that interest you. Also, please check the ALCTS website for other upcoming webinars, e-forums, and events, and for instructions on registering. All attendees will receive an online evaluation form from ALCTS. Please respond. We value your input and also your suggestions for future webinars. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Felicity Dicus for providing technical support for today's webinar. And again, we apologize to those of you who had audio problems. It unfortunately was not in our control, but we hope that you will get a clean recording of the session. We appreciate your attendance today. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to sharing other ALCTS webinar topics with you in the future.